The Holy Gospel according to St. Matthew, the 24th chapter. Glory to you, O Lord. Jesus said to the disciples, "About that day and hour no one knows, neither the angels of heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. For as the days of Noah were, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day Noah entered the ark, and they knew nothing until the flood came and swept them all away, so too will be the coming of the Son of Man. Then two will be in the field, one will be taken, one will be left. Two women will be grinding meal together, one will be taken, one will be left. Keep awake, therefore, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. But understand this, if the owner of the house had known in what part of the night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and would not have let his house be broken into. Therefore, you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an unexpected hour." The Gospel of the Lord. So our Advent season begins this year, as it does every year, with biblical calls to watch and to be alert for the signs of Jesus' coming and God's presence in our lives. Wake up, says Paul. Be ready, says Jesus. Calls to watch and prepare are to be found everywhere in our Advent readings. But what are we supposed to watch for? What are we supposed to be alert to? These were questions the disciples always asked Jesus whenever he talked about the coming of the Son of Man. And often, Jesus referenced big and sometimes scary signs, things that you really couldn't miss even if you tried. Just before today's gospel reading, for example, Jesus speaks again of things like wars and earthquakes. He talks about false prophets producing great signs and omens. And yet, says Jesus, do not be alarmed, do not go after them, and the end is not yet. So what are we supposed to watch for? What will happen for which we should stay awake? So in today's gospel reading, Jesus tells his followers what to watch for: the sign of Noah. And Jesus says that the sign of Noah is that nobody knew anything until it happened. It appears that the secret sign that the disciples want is that there is no sign. There is no secret sign. Nothing unusual is happening right before the end. People are just going along, doing their normal stuff, and then suddenly God acts. So how do we watch for nothing? How do we keep awake when there's nothing loud and splashy to keep our attention? I mean, it sort of seems counterintuitive. And yet, I think Jesus is serious about this sign of Noah stuff, this call to watch for seemingly nothing. In fact, it seems like the kind of being ready that Jesus called his first disciples to be about, and the kind of readiness that Jesus calls us to be about in our lives, isn't supposed to be a constant state of super hyped up on adrenaline nervousness that we sometimes think it is. Instead, the kind of readiness that Jesus describes, even in the midst of wars and earthquakes and famines and all kinds of terrible stuff, is really a kind of readiness that's centered on being about the regular daily work that we believe God is calling us to, even if it doesn't seem flashy or exciting. So Jesus goes on to talk about two guys out working in the field and two women grinding grain. These were two of the basic tasks that needed to happen every single day for people to survive and eat in the first century. These folks were doing what was necessary to sustain and preserve life in their community, and when the day arrives, like the faithful stewards in many of Jesus' parables, they were found doing their jobs. They were faithfully carrying out the work that God had given them to do. Kind of readiness that Jesus seems to be calling people to here is a kind of readiness that is found in not being distracted by the bright and shiny objects. I mean, just as there are today, the folks working in the field and grinding the grain were constantly aware of the wars and the rumors of wars, the earthquakes and the other disasters that happened to them and to others, even without social media to tell them. And as the stories of the Magi remind us, There were people who saw or thought they saw signs in the heavens which might or might not mean something. But apparently, they did not let those signs, even the bright and shiny ones, distract them from what their job was. They surely noticed, but they didn't let themselves be distracted. And this readiness that is found in watching for nothing, appears also to be centered on God's promise. See, Jesus begins this whole discourse with the words, about that day and that hour, nobody knows, not the angels, not the Son, only the Father. And that means that God knows. And God really is in control of history, no matter how out of control the world around you seems. And perhaps what made it possible for these folks to continue carrying on with their daily jobs day in and day out is that they trusted and centered themselves on the promise that God would make good on his promises and commitments to them. And that was true whether they ended up being the ones taken or the ones left behind. Either way, they were still safely in God's hands. And I think that this is really the kind of readiness that Jesus calls us to be about as well. Being alert is really about being alert to God's presence in our lives all the time. Being awake is really about focusing on the stuff God gives us to do each and every day. And watching is really about living with hope and expectation that the chaos of today is not all there is. And so for us too, watching for nothing is Jesus' call to be about the daily work that God gives us, even when it doesn't seem to be exciting or flashy. And sometimes I think that one of the challenges of living in the national capital area is that many people, even a bunch of us, are involved in things that really can make a difference globally or nationally. Stuff that we do, we can look back and say, you know what, I was part of having a national or global impact, which is great. But much of what we're called to do and be involved in each day, and much of what really makes a difference in the lives of others around us, is how we serve as good friends and parents and neighbors. It's about the daily ways that we act as God's agents of love and care in the immediate world around us. And for us too, being found faithfully doing the regular daily work we're called to do in the lives of those around us is an important part of the readiness to which Jesus calls us. For us also, the readiness of watching for nothing is Jesus' call not to be distracted by the bright and shiny objects. We all know how difficult this is. There was a cartoon a couple weeks ago that probably a lot of people saw where the character picks up his phone and he goes, all I'm going to do, because I have so much work to do, is I'm just going to check my work email. I need to check my work email. And then he goes to check his work email, and hours later he's been distracted from doing anything else because of the news, the social media, the games, all the other stuff that so often distracts us from our attention. We all know the way this is. Some of us have this problem every single day. I do. And it's not that some of the bright and shiny stuff isn't important or doesn't need to be dealt with. It's just that often, when we let those things distract us, we stop doing what we're supposed to be doing. We focus on the things that we cannot change, and we stop paying attention to the things where we actually could make a difference in the life of the world around us. For us too, simply fighting the distractions is often an important part of the readiness to which Jesus calls us. And for us too, sometimes watching for nothing is also about being centered on God's promise. One of the problems with focusing on all the wild and crazy signs in some of the apocalyptic literature is that we get centered on the wars, the earthquakes, the famines, the plagues, and the moon being turned to blood and all that kind of crazy, funny stuff. But thing is, even when those things are mentioned, they are never the point. Even when they seem to be the center of the story, they aren't. The point is always that God wins in the end. That's always the point of apocalyptic literature. God wins, even in spite of all of this horrible, crazy stuff. And perhaps the most important part of the continual readiness to which Jesus calls us is the daily centering ourselves on the promises of God and not the crazy stuff, And that's because those are the promises which can really sustain us and give us the strength to endure, no matter what's happening in the crazy world around us. In this Advent season, Jesus calls us to be ready. But often the readiness to which Jesus calls us is about watching for nothing in particular. Instead, readiness for Jesus is often about being about the daily work to which God calls us in our regular lives. Readiness for Jesus is about resisting the urge to focus on the bright and shiny objects that surround us, which is especially difficult this time of year. And readiness for Jesus is about being centered each day on God's promises to us, which can center and ground our lives even when crazy stuff is going on all around.